Also, there's some speculation that I saw again, and I'm going to say in the clickbait that this is going to affect housing prices. Well, I don't see that.
Welcome to this week's episode of Changing the Market. I'm your host today, Kevin Chamala, and with us is noted industry trendsetter and luminary and executive chairman of the Masiello Group, Chris Masiello. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Kevin. Good to be with you. Good to be with everybody in our community.
And today we have the hot topic that's floating around, right?
The hot topic, right?
Hot topic for sure. And I'm sure our listeners and our viewers probably know what we're leaning into here for today's conversation. Mm-hmm. But we're going to dive into the NAR litigation and the current proposed settlement that was released this past week. And I'm not gonna dive into the articles or to the settlement. There's a lot of information out there that people can read, especially from NAR. Today, we want to dive into some of the facts, right? The misinformation that's been communicated through media outlets because we know that they want to bring eyeballs to their stations. And sometimes that leads to disinformation and misinformation. And then we're going to dive into some of the facts. And then obviously, as always, providing some strategic advice to our viewers and listeners. So first, let's start with, let's dispel the misinformation about the NAR settlement that's out there.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I mean, look, the media cycle has a very short attention span, right? So there's a lot of clickbait floating out there, that gets people's attention, about commissions and how the real estate industry is going to drastically change. I think that really remains to be seen. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So there was a lot of clickbait out there, some articles that at a minimum were certainly confusing, and then at the extreme were just flat out not accurate. So then there's no reason to get into all that. But I think we could just kind of talk about, what kind of impact this really has on the consumer, right? And then how the industry, can deal with it and cope, with whatever changes might be coming down. So
yeah, and so with that in mind, right? Speaking of, I think the big issue with the settlement or the big conversation about the settlement is commissions. So what does that mean for our sellers and buyers in terms of the potential commission changes that might be coming way down the process?
Well, first of all, the system that has been set up, right, is in part has been set up because the real estate transaction is highly complex. At a consumer level, it's probably, I'm not going to say the most, although it might be, but certainly one of the most complex consumer transactions that there is. And so whether you're a buyer or a seller, it is very complex, and kind of like no differently than you wouldn't necessarily go to court to represent yourself, right? Because the court system is complicated. Well, it's the same thing with purchasing your home or an investment property. It is very complex, and it includes things like, understanding how to navigate the mortgage process, the title process, title insurance, homeowners insurance, local ordinances. It goes, the list goes on. And so it's the reason why, and it's a heavily regulated industry. I mean, when you think about, like, the average sales price in the United States is $410,000. Well, $410,000 of anything is a lot, okay? And so because of the nature of it, of the size of the transaction and the size of the transaction that it holds within the American family's investment portfolio, okay, which is what your property is, it is heavily regulated. Anytime you have heavy regulations, you have to know a heavily regulated transaction, but you have to know how to navigate it. So the system has been set up in a way where that your real estate agent, your advisor, advises you how to navigate the situation, right? Your purchase or your sale, depending on what side of it you're on, so that what is already complex and already moving and stressful, right? I think it's in the top three. I think it's like death, divorce, and moving, right? Last time I checked, the three most stressful things in life. So the system is truly designed to help people cope with it. And whether you're getting seller representation or buyer representation, that's what your agent does, is help you navigate it.
Yeah, right. I think it's a great analogy you used. And we all see what happens when people self-diagnose using things like WebMD, right? So you're definitely gonna
Right?
need
Don't self-diagnose them with MD. You're gonna miss something.
yeah, right. It's important, similar to a lot of life situations that are complex, to have the proper representation to help guide you through those situations, right? That's no different in the housing industry and in real estate.
Yeah, so there are a couple things here that don't change, right? The regulatory environment has not changed. As a matter of fact, since the '08, financial crash, right? The environment actually for buying and selling real estate has gotten more complex, not less. So that just that fact alone, that at a regulatory level, that things have gotten slightly more complex in the last 15 years, not less complex, and that's really not going to change. So the underlying process hasn't changed, and I think there are some kind of fundamental facts as it relates to the real estate transaction, that will remain true regardless of what the final outcome of this is. I mean, they have a settlement. It hasn't all been inked up yet. It's got to get approved by a judge. I'm sure there's a lot of details that still need to get worked out. They're talking about it taking several months, as I'm quoting National Association of Realtors, that this will take several months to get all the details ironed out. So we don't really fully know what all the details are yet, because some of them haven't been determined. Mm-hmm. And I'll talk a little bit about how different parts of the country handle like buyer brokerage and all that in just a second. But what I do want to talk about, though, is that there are some fundamental things that aren't going to change. One, it's still a heavily regulated transaction. That's not changing. Okay. What we do know is that when both buyer and seller are properly represented, it's a much smoother transaction. When we're in transactions where one party, one or the other party isn't properly represented, again, because of the complexity of the transaction, it's just bumpy. Mm-hmm. And like no one needs that. Mm-hmm. And that's the superpower that the agent has, is the ability to kind of navigate through these various challenges and intricacies. Also, there's some speculation that I saw again, and I'm going to say in the clickbait, is that this is going to affect housing prices. Well, I don't see that. I mean, look, housing prices are being driven now by a systemic shortage of inventory. Yep. Okay. Now, when you say systemic, what does that mean? Well, we're probably somewhere between a 7 to 10 year cycle of underbuilding. That's systemic. Mm-hmm. Okay. If for no other reason, just for pure supply and demand, this is not really going to impact housing prices. And I read some of these articles. I didn't really, I didn't really read a lot of them. Yeah. I read a couple of them. I had a couple of them got sent to me, like, you got to read this, and I was just reading some of them, and I'm like, wow, like you're like really not in touch with reality. Oh yeah. So like, if you really understand the underpinning of this housing cycle, right? So we're low on inventory. That's not changing anytime soon. And we keep threatening to do an episode about this, is about the demographics. We haven't done it yet. Yep. Something always jumps in the way. But when you take a look at the demographics, you've got you've got Gen X, Gen Z, millennials, and baby boomers all in the housing cycle right now, all together. We've never had this many distinct demographic groups competing for the same low inventory. Yep. This regulation or this change, whatever it might be, doesn't affect any of that. None of it. Mm-hmm. So I think if there's, from a buyer's perspective, if they're looking out there and saying, well, housing prices are going to go down, I'm going to wait, don't do it. Interest rates are going down. As interest rates go down, you're going to get more affordability. Prices will start to tick up a little bit more. Yep. This is not going to be a magic pill for affordability. What the magic pill for affordability is more housing, and housing is infrastructure, right? It's no different than schools, roads, churches, shopping malls, hospitals, traffic center, traffic rotaries, there's all infrastructure. And so what we need is more infrastructure. And this is not going to change that. There's another component, which is part of just human nature, that you're not going to be able to regulate out, is that today's home seller, it's up to them, and it always has been up to them. This is not new, right? It's always been up to the seller what they want to offer for cooperative compensation for another agent to bring a buyer to their property. It's always been up to them.
Yep.
That was another kind of misnomer in these articles, is that it was kind of set, or native custom by region, and not, no, it's always been up to the seller. And if you're a seller and you have a need, and you want to offer, better than average, and of course there are averages, right? But better than average compensation, for a buyer to bring a property to, for an agent to bring a property to your house. Well, what that does is it gives your property a little more notoriety. The seller is in total control of that. Now, a higher offer of compensation to bring a buyer doesn't mean that in of itself, someone's going to buy that listing. Right? Because like the agent can't talk someone into buying a house they don't want.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And the seller certainly, the buyer certainly isn't going to buy the house because
seller,
their buyer's agent's getting more of a commission. I mean, like, it has to meet their needs, and no agent does that. I mean, no agent, is going to look at it that way. I mean, what it is, it's for what's in the client's best interest, right?
Always.
However, from a marketing perspective, it does give the listing more prominence, because what it telegraphs is what the seller's motivation is. So if the seller is willing to offer slightly more compensation, that would typically mean that the seller is more motivated, right? So now you match features of the property with potential motivation. If you put the two together, then more often than not, then you might have a transaction. And so kind of fundamentally, these things don't go away. So there will be at some level, of course, a different type of maybe process that we go through. And I want to talk about the Northeast for a second, because it does operate differently than other parts of the country. Yeah,
I think I was just going to pause you right there, because I want you to just really restate that, because when these articles started, when this thing happened, I received so many texts from family, friends, old coworkers, whatever, right? And I think that myth about the commission compensation is so big that people don't understand that. So if we can just hammer that away one last time, saying who controls that and what that means to both buyers and sellers, that'd be great.
Yeah, the seller always controls what gets offered for cooperative fees. It's part of our disclosure process. It's in our listing agreements. It's pretty hard to avoid. And if I go back, I've been in the industry a bit, so we won't get to how many years, but it's been a beat. Like years ago, when we had sellers who wanted to really get their property sold, they would offer a sales bonus. Builders would do that. I think developers still do that at some level, right? And what it's broadcasting is the seller's motivation. This isn't about bribing people to buy houses. Okay, that's not a thing.
Nope.
Right? You buy your house because you love it, because it meets your needs. You can see your family there. You can see Christmas, right? All these different things, right? Kids' birthdays, and taking prom pictures in the foyer, and that's why you buy your house, right? It's not because someone's offered a sales bonus or a higher offer of cooperative commission that all of a sudden, like, that's the magic pill to buy the house. It does, though, make the property more noticeable. It's a form of marketing.
Yep.
No more or less complicated than that. It's just marketing.
No, it's spot on. That is spot on.
I think there's one other really critical part to this conversation as it relates to like buyer brokerage compensation. The first is that when a buyer is properly represented, as we discussed a little while ago, right? It's a much smoother transaction. But when the buyer is represented and they have their own client relationship, right, with their buyer broker, it dramatically, and I mean dramatically, reduces the likelihood of any post-transaction litigation. The buyer saying, hey, you didn't tell me this, or I didn't know that, or, I didn't know that I couldn't do something, with a lot line adjustment, or I couldn't put, whatever the case may be, right? Housing is complicated, so it could be any number of things. And that's worth its weight in gold. Smoother transaction, you're limiting your liability. You can make, when you're selling, you can make plans, right? Like you want to, like, it's stressful. You're going to get up one morning and the toaster's not going to be in the same place.
Yep.
I mean, all those things, right, are stressful for people. And so having a smooth transaction, it's one of the reasons why the system is set up the way it is that for people to have proper representation, so that these transactions aren't train wrecks. And when you start to get people that are unrepresented, trust me, right? I'm not going to say they're all train wrecks, because there are very few absolutes in life, but most of them are train wrecks.
Oh, 100%.
The other piece is that for a buyer, and it would not be uncustomary for some buyers to pay some part of their representation costs. However, given the expense for financing and all moving and all those different things, movers are expensive, right? And some people do it themselves. Well, some people can't. I got too much furniture, whatever the case may be. When you fold it all in, right? It's a very expensive process for the consumer. And then now what you're going to say to a buyer who typically, they've got the burden of a lot of the closing costs, right? For their mortgage and all that, you're going to say to them, we want you to pay, whatever the number is, a few to several $1,000s more. That's a real burden.
Yep.
And I think some of the reason why this got settled is because this is just maybe a slight color commentary for me. I think some of the reasons why this got settled, because when it was going to go to the appellate court level, would it survive on the merits? And that just, at least to me, seems a question, because it's really hard to look at this and say that this is in the consumer's best interest. It's really, really hard. No,
I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? Who does this favor the most, right? And right now, from a lot of people's perspective, is like, I mean, it's not really benefiting the consumer at the end of the day, to a large degree.
It's a pretty hard argument to make.
Yeah.
I mean, if I was on the other side of it, I get it. Everybody wants to do things for the least amount of money and all that, so we understand that.
Yeah.
However, this is a big purchase. Like you don't do on average, like you don't do $400,000 on the cheap. Nope. You just don't.
For most people, that's at the most twice in a lifetime, right? That's most often not.
It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point too, Kevin, because the average consumer now, it used to be people stayed in their houses, 6-7 years, something like that. The average consumer now, because of inventories in their house, I think it's 9 to 11 years.
I was going to say, I thought I saw 9 to 11 out there floating around.
Yeah. And I'm sure it changed. I'm sure it's different in other parts of the country, but just say on average. But if you're only doing something if you're doing something only once every 9 years, a lot changes in 9 years.
100%.
So your experience 9 years ago, where I bought and sold a house 9 years ago, and now I'm going to do it today, you might find that it's demonstrably different.
No, yeah, I think we've hit a lot of those right on the money. The issues that can come up during the transaction, post-transaction, is why it's important to have their representation. I'm sure you and I can both share anecdotal stories about why that's imperative and how beneficial it is to have representatives such as a realtor assisting you through that process. And so that's a great part one for our listeners, because this is a big bag. Right? It's a big bag of issues that we got to get through and try to bring some more clarity for our audience. So I think what will be great is to leave them here with part one of this conversation regarding the NAR settlement and dispelling some myths, right, about the commission compensations and really what this means for the consumer. So in part two, we can really dive into different demographics. I know you mentioned the Northeast that you wanted to dive into. We could also talk about strategies moving forward and if those change based on our previous discussions, And then we'll close up with our usual great piece of advice on how to move forward in this world, whether it's real estate or your day-to-day life. So thank you for tuning in today for part one of our discussion regarding NAR settlement. We're excited for you to tune in next week to join us again with Chris for part two.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, everybody.